Hi, everyone. This is Amy Elizabeth from Right On Con. I am so excited to be talking to Kat Shepard today. We're going to be talking about lessons from Hollywood using screenwriting techniques to tweak your novel. Thank you so much for joining us, Kat. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no problem. Let us dive right in. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and we'll jump right into screenwriting techniques.
Sure. I'm a former classroom teacher, and I moved to LA in 2009. And so I left teaching and started doing other things instead. And one of the side jobs I picked up to earn money was being a reader for a studio. So what that meant was that people would send in their screenplays, and then they would send them to me. And then my job was to read the screenplay and then provide what's called coverage, which means that I look at certain aspects of the story, what's working, what's not, how to make it better, and then I decide whether it's a good fit for the studio or not. The lowest level job that you can have in Hollywood, but it was really fun and I learned a lot. And that's actually what got me into writing. I started writing screenplays and then I switched over and started writing middle grade novels. And my first middle grade series debuts June 5th of this year. It's called Babysitting Nightmares, and the first book is called The Shadow Hand.
Great. Well, that sounds wonderful. Why don't you tell us what script coverage is and how it works?
Sure. All right. So script coverage is where studios and production companies will hire people to read, summarize, and critique scripts that people are sending in. If you think about the average development executive, a development executive is someone who works at a studio and looks for properties for the studio to buy and develop for film or TV. They might get hundreds of scripts a week even. So they don't have the time or resources to read them all. So that's why they hire people like me, which were freelance people working from anywhere in the country who would read the scripts, write a brief summary, notes, recommendations, and then send it along saying either you should pass, meaning don't buy this, or consider it, meaning buy or option this and see if it's something that you want to develop. We are the lowest gatekeepers for getting a screenplay up the ladder. Script readers are freelance. They work for very low pay, but you can work anywhere. And it's a great way to read within your genre and learn what works and doesn't work. So when I was a reader, I used a template to give coverage. And we have linked one here so that you can see what it looks like. It's pretty basic. Just give me 1 second to pull mine up here. Okay, so if you look at the top, there's a lot of stuff on there that you can sort of ignore. So you don't need, for example, to know who the executive is that you're reading for. I just felt like there's no need to reinvent the wheel, so I'll just use what worked for me. And then you see there is a little box kind of underneath where it says log line, and under that you'll see a little grid with overview comments. So that kind of is the executive summary up there, which is what I ended up usually doing last. But it was something so that the reader could pass that along, and then the exec could just look at the first page and be like, okay, this is sort of the basic gist of what this person is saying. Below that is a space for the synopsis, which is where you write a summary of the plot. And then underneath are your comments, which are where you flesh out what was in the executive summary. And usually those comments focus on 4 different categories: the premise, characterization, dialogue, and storyline. So when I used this template, I kind of did this as a really efficient way of looking at a script and figuring out how the story flows, kind of pulling out what was important and figuring out what I needed to do. So how is this helpful for your own novel? That is the big question, I think. And sorry, I'm having a hard time putting into words. The basic thing that I loved about being a reader was I love problem solving. And that's actually how I look at things as a writer. I like to think about writing as solving a problem. How do I get character from point A to point B in sort of the most interesting and honest way possible? So when I looked at things from a reader perspective, I was looking at it in a way of critiquing with a focus on making it better. It allowed me to break things down and look at specific details as opposed to looking at something as a whole. So if you look at this again, there is that box where we have premise, characterization, dialogue, and storyline. Those were kind of the four main things that you look at when you're looking at a screenplay. So we'll start with premise, and then I'll talk about how you can apply that to your novel as well. So the premise is also known as the log line. So what a log line is it's a one sentence descriptor of what the story is. So it might be something like two kids have to go undercover to save the world from an evil monster, something like that. That would be an example of a log line. A log line is also where you get across the concept of what your work is. So in Hollywood, they talk a lot about high concept. So a high concept idea is one that can easily be pitched and easily communicated. It really succinctly answers the question, what's this about? So when you think about your own novel, you should know immediately what's the concept of your novel? What's the premise of your novel? So when you kind of look and do coverage on yourself, you first have to be able to say, can I put the premise of what I wrote in some easily relatable idea? Okay, so examples, a man falls in love with a mermaid. A girl joins an online dare game and things get out of hand. 4 kids are abandoned by their mother and must find their way home. So that's what I would say would be the log line for the movie Splash, the book by Jeannie Ryan, Nerve, which just was a movie maybe about a year or two ago. And the last one was Homecoming by Cynthia Voigt. So you can take even more complicated ideas and put it into one sentence. If you can't easily communicate your premise, sometimes that's a sign that your novel might have problems. So forcing yourself to think about the premise is a really helpful way for you to make sure that you really know what your book is about. Even long stories with multiple plot strands should be able to do this. Like I think about 2 stories that I love that were really complicated. Like you look at The Godfather and you have all these characters and they're, you're following over like years and years and years and all these different storylines. But what is the book really about? It's about a reluctant son taking on his father's mantle in a changing landscape. That's The Godfather. The other stuff is part of the story, but it's really about a father and a son. Lord of the Rings, another of my favorite books of all time. It's about an innocent hobbit who's called on to risk his life and save the world. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on, but really the story is about this hobbit. His viewpoint is our entry point into the world, and he's the heart and soul of the story. Again, lots of other stuff. What's it really about? It's about Frodo Baggins. So the premise is a really important part of writing, and making sure that you know what that is important too. Most people come up with an idea first, and then that's the premise of their story. And then you get to what I think is actually the really, really, really heart and soul of everything, which is structure. And this is one of the reasons that screen reading and screenwriting taught me so much, because it is all about structure in screenplays. You have a set formula. It falls within a certain range of length. If you're talking about a movie or feature script, that's divided into 3 acts that are further broken down to a total of about 40 beats or scenes. TV scripts work a little differently. They have 5 acts, and I don't know as much about them. So I'm going to talk mostly about feature scripts. So I found that really helpful and really comforting, because I sort of knew what those trail markers were when I was telling a story or when I was reading a story. I sort of knew what needed to happen and about when. When is the audience ready for this? When is the audience ready for this? It's going to drag if we get to this a few pages later than we usually would. That makes it sound really formulaic, but it's not. If you think about a symphony, that's a set structure, specific rules, and look at all the different symphonies that exist in the world. Or I also think about it like people. So if you have, everybody has the same basic skeleton under the skin for the most part. So we're, for the most part, the same basic form. But if you look at people, everyone looks different. Everybody moves differently. Everyone is still absolutely unique from one another, even though we have the same skeleton underneath. So if you focus on structure, which is something that screenwriting allows you to do, and then reading for structure is something that you do if you give yourself coverage, it allows you to remember where you're going and how you're getting there. It's purposeful. It gives us efficient and effective storytelling. I would say that focusing on structure made me a stronger, happier, and more creative writer. I've used everything I learned about reading and writing screenplays and putting it into my books. And it's really helped me make sure my plot is really tight, my pacing is good, and the story is kind of moving right along. I write for 8 to 12-year-olds, so you really want to, with that age group, you definitely want to make sure that like you're keeping their interest. So that's been really helpful. So a big part of structure is pacing. So pacing for the story as a whole. So you think like, okay, when are we jumping into the action? Okay, how much breakdown is there between description and action? Where does it feel like it's dragging? So pacing is part of that structure. I know, for example, in Hollywood, if my husband works where he turns books into movies. And so a lot of times when he decides what books he wants to buy, he's like, if your book, the action doesn't start until page 100, that's probably not going to be made into a movie. And that's not to say that it's not a great book. It just means for that format, that wouldn't be a good fit. So pacing is a really important piece of what you do, depending on what you're trying to do with your story. You also need pacing for individual beats or scenes. So one of my favorite rules from screenwriting that I think about all the time and I use all the time is arrive late, leave early. So what that means is if you ever notice how in movies almost no one ever says goodbye before they hang up the phone, it's because it's really boring and nobody needs to see it. So you can cut those boring bits that we don't need, and you can still make sure the story is being told. So I do that a lot of times in my scenes in a book is sometimes I'll start the scene kind of in the middle because I don't need to see the setup for the scene. You can drop the reader right in and they know where they are. So it's again that kind of efficient storytelling that gets you to where you want to go without having to waste your time on things that maybe you're not so excited about writing or that your reader's not so excited about reading. I also feel like pacing is really important because we pace scenes differently based on what's happening. If you think about a movie, like an action movie, and there's a big fight scene, you have a lot of short cuts. You see this and it cuts here and the camera's cutting here and you're jumping around a lot. Because when you think about when you read action, you're doing the same thing as a reader. Like I know if I'm at a really exciting scene in a book, I'm almost skimming because I'm so excited to work through that. I'm so excited to get to what's going to happen next and what's going to happen next. So when you're writing an action sequence, it's going to pace differently from when you write a sequence where it's like a cozy scene outside a library. Again, if you think about film, the camera might scan slowly around the room and you see the roaring fireplace and you see people cuddled up and there's books everywhere. And that's how you would write that. You would write it in that kind of slow pan with the camera. There might be more description there. Again, going back to the fight scene, if two characters in a fight to the death, I'm not going to stop to describe what they're wearing. We're not looking at what they're wearing. We want to know what's happening. So the way we write that kind of scene in a novel is going to look really different from how we would write another kind of scene. Same like with a suspenseful scene, you're going to draw out that pacing to build that suspense. With an exposition scene, you might want to get the info out as efficiently as you can and move on. Tell them what they need to know and let them get back to the story. So pacing is a big part of structure. And so screenplays, reading screenplays, thinking about how it's structured as you watch is a great way to look at your own writing and make sure that pacing is working in your books. So the other thing we would read for as readers was characterization. So the way I think about it is the plot is the skeleton, the character's a muscle. They do the moving and the heavy lifting. Characters drive plot. Right? Muscles move the skeleton doesn't move the muscles. So if your characters aren't driving the plot, it may be a sign that your novel has problems. So things, as a general rule, you don't want things to happen to your character. You want things to happen as a result of your character. So if you think about like one of my favorite movies is this action movie called The Rundown, directed by Peter Berg. I'm a huge fan. The Rock is in it. But it's the story is about like three protagonists who all want the same thing for different reasons, and they're sort of in conflict with one another. And that movie is a huge action movie. Thing after thing after thing happens, and everything in the movie happens as a result of things that the protagonist decided to do. So even though it's this action movie with crazy explosions and everything else, everything happens as a result of one of these three characters' choices, one of these three characters' feelings or actions. So that's what I mean by characters driving plot. They need to be pretty active. And you also want to make sure that they're not just a function of the plot. You don't want to just have a character in there whose job is just to make a certain thing happen. It really has to feel like that character organically made that happen, if that makes sense. So when you're thinking about revising, these are the things that I looked at when I was reading screenplays, when I looked at characters. Are the characters likable? Are we rooting for them? And sometimes you have characters that aren't likable and they're sort of likably unlikable. But as a general rule, if you want someone to stick with what you're writing, you want to make sure that your character is someone that they are interested and willing to follow. You want to make sure your characters are believable. Are they equally rich and nuanced, or some of the characters props or stereotypes? Can we relate to them? Do they have enough to do? So those are all questions that I would ask. And I think it's really important when we talk about whether or not we can relate to characters. I'm not talking about things like class or race or things like that. I think it's important for people to have mirrors, but I think it's also important for people to have windows in writing. There are lots of ways to relate to a character. And I'm a big fan of Shannon Hale, and she talks a lot about boy and girl books and how there's really no such thing. And we sort of expect that boys can't relate to girl characters and boys won't read books with girl characters. But there's no reason why they couldn't. Every person has something that we can relate to, and all of our characters should be relatable as well. When we look at characterization, especially for novels, I would think a lot about voice, especially for novels in the first person. You want to think about, does this voice feel believable? Can I feel the author's hand too heavily? Am I willing to sit with this voice for the remainder of the book? And what I mean by voice is I think about Lord of the Rings, again, one of my favorite books of all time. So even there are sentences in that book that I love so much that I'll reread them over and over again. Like I'll savor them, like, oh, that's so good. It still feels, I don't feel the author's hand. It still feels almost invisible. When you read that book, the story feels effortless. It feels like it just sprang into being, and I just forget that I'm reading. It just feels like it's just unfolding and I'm not reading words. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how Tolkien did that. I wish that I could someday get to that point. But that's sort of, I think, a perfect example of voice where the writing is beautiful, but it doesn't feel forced. You don't feel the author poking around. Another book of Tolkien's, The Hobbit, I cannot stand that book because the author's hand feels heavy and the voice is overly precious, and I really had to make myself finish it. It's a very different kind of voice. The last thing I think about for characterization is when you're looking at your characters, reading that with a critical eye as a reader, you want to ask yourself, does the writing feel like it's coming from a place of honesty? Characters should have flaws and make mistakes. And if your character is solely there to stand in for an idea or a lesson of some kind, that can kind of hurt your ability to tell a story well. And it might, again, mean that there might be some problems in your novel. So the last thing that I would read for as a script reader was dialogue. Obviously, dialogue is incredibly important in film, but it's equally important in your novels. For me, dialogue is what makes or breaks a story. For the most part, it's how we get to know the characters. It's how we get exposition explained. It's really a big piece of what makes a novel work. There were tons of scripts where I would say pass on this because the dialogue was bad. So what does bad dialogue look like? The number one reason is if it doesn't feel natural. Your reader can spot inauthentic dialogue a mile away. And my personal biggest pet peeve, because I read for children and family entertainment, were kids who didn't talk like real kids. Either the kids would sound too young for their age, or they sounded like mini adults, or or maybe they don't use contractions, or they felt like they were talking like they were living in the 1930s, but the book was set in contemporary times. So making sure that kids talk like real kids is really important to me. But all of your people should talk like who they are. It should feel like the dialogue is coming out of the character's mouth and not yours. So the number two reason that's really can be really tough is if your characters don't have distinct voices. I know that I struggled with this a lot with Shadowhand because I have 4 preteen girls. They're all best friends with common interests. And it took a ton of work and revision to make sure that each girl felt like a distinct and separate person. And I'm still not sure I got there. I mean, there are certain lines where I felt like, oh, I could just choose between 2 characters and figure out which person would say that line. That's a weakness. That's something that I still have to work on. So when I did find this happening, I know that I have to go back and do more character work. I have to decide who's more likely to say that and why. What's her life experience? What's her backstory? So then I'll go back and kind of do like sheets where I describe my characters or, give their backstory. One really great thing you can do to tell if your dialogue is good or bad is what screenwriters do is they'll often have a table read where they have actors or friends sit around a table and read their screenplay out loud. If you're worried about your dialogue in your novel, invite people over and ask them to read your scene out loud and listen to them. Then you can ask them how they felt about it. This is a super effective and fast way to spot dialogue problems and fix them. If you feel shy or you don't have that crew, then what I do when I'm writing dialogue is I'll totally act the scenes out myself. Sometimes I'm like whispering to myself. as I'm workshopping them while I'm typing, or I'll stand up, move around. I use physical gestures. I try different intonations so I can imagine what the characters might talk about. So I definitely think that hearing your dialogue is a huge part of what helps make it better. And again, that's the advantage screenplays have, is you get to hear people read it. You get to see people act it out. And you can do the same thing with your novel. So looking at coverage and screenwriting, and why I think it's an effective tool for novel writing or any kind of writing, is because really what it does is it breaks things down. So when you're doing coverage, when you're reading for specific elements, you're breaking things into manageable pieces, and that makes it easier to look at them closely. It's, again, rather than having to look at your whole novel and being like, something's not working and I don't know what it is. But if instead you look and you go, okay, you know what? I'm reading for these 4 things. I'm reading for plot. I'm reading for characters. I'm reading for make sure the premise makes sense, and I'm reading for dialogue. Then if one of those things isn't working, then you can tweak that and you can go in and do a little bit of surgery. And just going back a little bit to plot and structure, you also should be able to summarize your book pretty easily. Right. So writing a synopsis of your book as part of kind of doing that revision work is incredibly helpful, because it helps you figure out what is the really truly important storyline. What's the important element here that I need to make sure the thread follows, and like what is extraneous. So it just helps you refine what the story is about. And it also helps you understand if your plot is maybe too complicated, or you haven't highlighted one storyline enough. Like if maybe you have 3 storylines, but one of them is really the sort of taproot of the story, then you might see that. You're like, oh, well, this is what the story is really kind of about, but I'm not highlighting that as much. So I would say the other thing about this type of critical thinking as you're writing is it's really about problem solving. So just like in revising, writing is about problem solving. It's about figuring out how to get your character from point A to point B in the most honest way possible. And it's also about problem solving of how can I make this better? There are a ton of resources out there to help you. And the number one that in Hollywood, it's like the Bible. And it's so like, if you live there, I remember going to the bookstore because I wanted to get it and being like kind of embarrassed, because you're like, can I get this book? And it's like, it's right on the counter. They always have it ready to go because people are always coming in and buying it. But it's called Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. A lot of people outside of Hollywood have heard of it too, but I'm always surprised when people are like, oh, I've never heard of that book. So it is a wonderful book on story and structure. And I recommend it to everyone, from like a first-time writer to a seasoned pro who's never looked at it. I feel like there's always something new to learn from it. And there are some sequel books that are great too. Online, you can find there's a beat sheet that Blake Snyder teaches you. And the beat sheet is kind of like that breakdown of your story into those kind of 40 beats. And I've done that a lot. I find that really helpful to use. So you can find that online, or you can make your own, or I'm happy to send you one. I just didn't feel comfortable making it available here because it's not mine. I didn't make it. I use it sometimes when I watch movies and TV. And I will sit there with a beat sheet in front of me, and then I will take notes and I will write down what are the beats, and I'll even write down at what time did the thing happen, in this movie. So you can use that beat sheet for your own novel as well. And just kind of that helps you check the pacing and see if you're hitting those elements or those sort of storytelling tropes. The other resource is just to watch a lot of stuff. Watch a lot of movies, watch a lot of TV, watch what your audience watches, watch the genre you want to write, and watch stuff that's terrible and figure out why, and take those notes. And those are incredibly helpful. I think that watching stuff has made a big difference in, getting me unstuck, or getting me to think about something different, or looking at other ways to tell a story. And I also think it's really important to remind people that it's so helpful to consume content that's really good, but it's also helpful to consume content that's really bad. I read so many bad screenplays, and every one of them taught me something new about writing. So, don't turn up your nose at something that you think is kind of trashy, because it might give you some insight into either what not to do, or you might go, oh, this is why everybody's reading this very trashy book that I think is scandalously terrible. So I think that there's a lot to be learned from just reading and consuming stuff widely. So those are my techniques that I pulled up.
Great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We have time maybe for just a couple questions. So is there any advice that you might give to a novelist who wants to get into screenwriting?
Mainly it would be don't, which is, it's not very nice to say, but it's a really, like, if you think writing novels is a tough business, writing screenplays is so much worse. So just some little statistics. So again, these are things that my husband often says to people, which is if somebody buys your book, there's a 90% chance that it's going to get published. If somebody options your screenplay, there's a 90% chance it won't get made. 90% of screenplays that get optioned never ever get made into films, whereas 90% of books that get bought actually end up being published. So right there, you've limited your likelihood. It's basically like winning the lottery. I mean, to see your, like, A, to get somebody to buy your screenplay, and then B, to actually get it to the point where there's a movie coming out. It's about as rare as winning the lottery. I mean, it's really, really challenging. And it's also incredibly a long process. So there's a property that my husband has been trying to make into a movie for as long as we've been together, and we've been together almost 10 years. And like, you would be like, I'm sure there were so many times where like the screenwriter was like, it's happening. And then it was like, oh, the financing fell through, or like they needed a different director, or they're back to the drawing board, or they changed development executives. So whereas I feel like a book, in some ways you have a lot of control. When you have a screenplay, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of people that are going to be working on this property. And so your screenplay is in the hands of all of those people. So it is a rough business.
Wow. And just time for one last question, I think. For all the people listening, what do you think are some of the benefits to writing in different forms, like trying screenwriting, trying something different?
Yeah. I think it is incredibly helpful. I encourage it so much, because I think that when you try something new, first of all, it teaches you a new way to tell a story, or a new way to think about story, which can help unblock you. Like if you're writing the same way all the time, you're just feeling stuck, or you're like not having fun anymore, trying something new kind of just gives you a different perspective. So I think that's hugely important and valuable. I also think it's really important to play. And when you try something new in your work, it allows you to play again, because like I have to write a lot of books really quickly. So like I sit down, and it's like I have to do 1,000 words a day and blah, blah, blah. And then after a while I can, like, there's those days where you're like, I don't want to do this and I don't feel like it, but you kind of have to sit down and do it. So you can lighten your heart, and you can give yourself a feeling of play again by trying something new. And I feel like when we're playing and when we're just doing things with a lightness of heart, then it's where we do our best work. So experimenting gives us that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been wonderful. Tell us, when is your book coming out? Is it this year?
Yeah, it's this year. So Babysitting Nightmares, The Shadow Hand comes out on June 5th, and it's through in print under Macmillan. And it will be available everywhere, but you can pre-order it now if you want to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. We'll sign off here. Thanks again, Kat.
Thank you.